Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Watching Darkness Fall, FDR, His Ambassadors, and the Rise of Adolf Hitler, by David Mckean, narrated by Tom Perkins. Author's Note: In 2004, I published a book about one of President Roosevelt's most important yet little-known political advisors, Thomas Corcoran, known by the President as Tommy the Cork. Corcoran was a brilliant lawyer, an energetic operative, and a vibrant personality who played an important role in the New Deal. Roosevelt never had a chief of staff, but for a period of time, no one had more influence on domestic policy and access to the president than Tommy the Cork. A decade after writing about Corcoran, I served as United States ambassador to Luxembourg, one of the first countries overrun by the Nazis in 1940. I remember on Veterans Day walking among the marble headstones marking the graves of fallen American heroes at Ham Cemetery, the second largest American military cemetery in Europe, and wondering how President Roosevelt had navigated the events leading up to World War II. Later, after returning to the United States, I wondered who had advised Roosevelt during this critical period. How did the president make decisions when confronted with the rise of fascism? Who was his Tommy Corcoran in foreign policy? I decided to investigate the role of United States ambassadors in Europe in the run-up to the war, believing that whatever role they played would also reveal something about Roosevelt and his leadership. John Gunther, a journalist in the 1930s and one of Roosevelt's earliest biographers, maintained, "Sometimes Roosevelt made terrible appointments. He shopped for ambassadors, it seemed, like a housewife choosing among apples over the telephone." I discovered that, in fact, there was a great disparity in both the abilities and competencies of many of Roosevelt's ambassadors, something that could probably be said of the Ambassador Corps, comprised of both political and foreign service appointees during every administration in the 20th century and continuing to this day. I decided not to write about the events or the ambassadors in Asia or Latin America, which of course would be critical to gaining a more complete picture of American foreign policy during this period. Nevertheless, the story of Roosevelt and his ambassadors in Europe between 1933 and 1941 provides a new perspective on the president and his principal advisors as they struggled to deal with the rise of fascism. I could never really understand what was going on in Roosevelt's heavily forested interior. His character was not only multiplex, it was contradictory to a bewildering degree. Robert Sherwood. Roosevelt believed in his own ability so long as he was at the controls to stem this terrible tide. He had all the character and energy and skill of the dictators, and he was on our side. Isaiah Berlin. Introduction. After the bugle sounded, followed by the ceremonial music of the Marine Band, Franklin Roosevelt, his arm locked to that of his eldest son James, walked slowly to the lectern on the Capitol's east portico. As he stood, hatless and coatless, tens of thousands of eager supporters who had long waited in the cold on the Capitol's grounds cheered loudly. Roosevelt raised his right hand and placed his left hand on a Dutch family Bible brought to the New World by his ancestors. Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes administered the oath of office, ending with the President's promise to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, so help me God. The more than 150,000 spectators who huddled together on the grounds of the U.S. Capitol roared their approval. When Roosevelt was sworn in as 32nd President of the United States in March 1933, during the throes of an unprecedented economic crisis, he most assuredly never anticipated that, by the end of the decade, he would be preoccupied with foreign policy. And yet, by 1940, Roosevelt found his presidency increasingly consumed with the march of fascism and widening conflict in Europe. Although it was ultimately the Japanese who precipitated America's entry into World War II, during his third term in office, Roosevelt had grown increasingly concerned that the war already raging in Europe threatened democracy everywhere, including in the United States. Roosevelt came to the presidency with a particular appreciation for European customs and culture. French and German governesses tutored him until he was 14, and he accompanied his parents on their frequent travels to Europe during the summer months. He also knew something of Europe's turbulent history and bitter rivalries. As a young man, he served in the Wilson administration and knew well the impact of the Great War, in which 10 million soldiers were killed and an equal number of civilians perished. As president, Roosevelt's views and ultimately his policies concerning Europe were shaped by his own experiences. But he also gleaned information about international developments from many sources: newspapers, diplomatic cables, former diplomats, and friends who traveled abroad. However, nothing was more important to his understanding of the foreign landscape than the information and analysis he received from his ambassadors. The president wanted to know what his ambassadors were seeing at post, to whom they were talking, and what they thought. Stricken by polio, which limited his ability to travel, and in an age before today's instant communication, he was a voracious reader of cables and an inveterate letter-writer. Whenever his ambassadors were in Washington, D.C., he nearly always met with them. Sometimes the ambassadors provided prescient advice, other times they were terribly mistaken. A born skeptic, Roosevelt understood the value of information collected on the ground and had an uncanny ability to sift through the often contradictory data and opinions he received. Roosevelt's direct communication with his ambassadors was atypical, but he didn't especially care about protocol. In fact, he had little respect for the Department of State as an institution of government. In part, his disdain stemmed from his view that most diplomats were entitled bureaucrats marking time during a grave economic crisis. He was partially correct. After decades of American isolation in the world, diplomats didn't have a lot to do, but neither did they show much initiative. In fairness, it wasn't entirely their fault. There was no overarching conception of America's role in the world around which to focus the work of diplomacy. Roosevelt's criteria for choosing ambassadors varied from man to man depending on the country. He doled out embassies to friends, campaign contributors, and the occasional professional. Although many of Roosevelt's ambassadors were from a similar social background, it is difficult to find common denominators in the choices he made for those who served him in key positions, except for two consistent traits. He appeared to value loyalty and trustworthiness above all else. While he didn't necessarily choose the most capable individuals, he sized up men better than any politician of his era and built each of his personal and political relationships on a set of commonalities, distinct for each man. With William Dodd, his ambassador to Germany, Roosevelt appealed to their shared admiration for the international idealism of Woodrow Wilson. With Breckinridge Long, appointed to Italy, Roosevelt shared a cultural and class affinity, not to mention the love of political battle. With William Bullitt, ambassador to the Soviet Union and, later, to France, he shared a sense of humor, bonhomie, and an unabashed optimism. Then there was his ambassador to the United Kingdom, Joseph P. Kennedy, with whom Roosevelt had little in common. They did not enjoy a personal chemistry and were more competitors than friends. But Roosevelt did respect Kennedy's drive and ambition, though he felt constantly compelled to check it. After World War I, during his political career in New York, Roosevelt had observed Americans turn inward, become skeptical of foreign entanglements, and grow suspicious of European governments that couldn't seem to resolve their differences or pay their international debts. Yet, almost from the moment he became president, Roosevelt sensed that the futures of America and Europe were intertwined. Two of his ambassadors, Dodd and Bullitt, generally shared the president's worldview. Ambassador Long somewhat admired European fascism, and Kennedy, like most Americans at the time, was an avowed isolationist. Dodd and Bullitt, Long and Kennedy personified the different approaches to foreign policy and their advice was often emblematic of the tensions pulling Roosevelt in opposite directions. These four ambassadors, some of whose diplomatic service overlapped with one another, served in the most important posts in Europe during the 1930s. Watching Darkness Fall is their story, the story of a fascinating though problematic team of men who had little in common except that they witnessed and interpreted for the president many of the most tumultuous events leading up to World War II. It is also the story as well of a president who weighed their advice and ultimately made the fateful decision to take the country to war. And finally, it is the story of America's struggle to define its role in a changing world. Prologue. Happy days are here again. Inspired by his older fifth cousin, President Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt's political career began in 1910 at the age of 28 when he was elected to the New York State Senate. Tall, good-looking, with a square jaw and gray-blue eyes, Franklin was charismatic and a gifted orator. He sported a pince-nez like his cousin, but in contrast to the high-pitched nasal timbre of T.R., his voice was clear, strong, and melodic. And when the young senator smiled, his face lit up, projecting a warmth and friendliness that enveloped those around him. Franklin followed in the footsteps of his cousin T.R. when, after only 3 years in state government, newly elected President Woodrow Wilson appointed the 31-year-old state senator with a famous name to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy. As the second most powerful man in the Navy, Roosevelt was responsible for civilian personnel as well as administration of naval bases and the operations and contracting at shipyards. It gave him exposure to the workings of the federal government, and because he was responsible for upgrading and expanding the Navy during the Great War, he received an education in international relations as well. By 1920, Roosevelt was viewed as a rising star in the Democratic Party, and was nominated for vice president on the ticket with Governor James M. Cox. Although Republicans Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge soundly defeated the Democrats, the experience gave Roosevelt a political education in running for higher office and an appreciation for the vastness and diversity of the nation. Retreating to New York after the election, Roosevelt joined a law firm, but was stricken with polio during the summer of 1921 while on vacation at Campobello Island in New Brunswick, Canada. In January 1922, Roosevelt was fitted with braces that locked in at the knee and continued the length of his leg. By the spring of that year he could stand with assistance, and he returned to his law practice. In 1924, at the Democratic National Convention, he gave presidential nominating speeches for Governor Al Smith. The speech marked a return to public life for Roosevelt, and 4 years later he ran successfully for governor of New York, succeeding Smith in office. After the stock market crash of 1929 and President Hoover's failure to effectively address the deepening economic crisis, Roosevelt, with encouragement from his wife Eleanor, ran for president. In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt campaigned on ending the Great Depression and restoring American prosperity. He focused almost exclusively on the domestic economy, broadly laying out his vision for a New Deal. While the concept was rooted in a political realignment toward progressivism, Roosevelt offered few specifics about what he would actually do if elected, leading some to question his commitment to making his vision a reality. Walter Lippmann, one of the era's leading journalists and pundits, observed, "Franklin D. Roosevelt is no crusader. He is no tribune to the people. He is no enemy of entrenched privilege. He is a pleasant man who, without any important qualifications for the office, would very much like to be president." Like so many political observers at the time, Lippmann vastly underestimated Roosevelt, but correctly characterized the governor's campaign to be based more on personal charisma than any blueprint for the future. Roosevelt loved interacting with people, and his magnetism translated to votes. During the 1932 campaign, he projected a warmth and confidence that communicated genuine concern for the people, and assured voters that he would use the highest office in the land to fight for them. Because the economy was the most important issue on voters' minds, candidate Roosevelt almost never mentioned foreign policy. When he did, his message conformed to the isolationist mood that was sweeping the country, articulated most clearly by newspaper publishing magnate William Randolph Hearst. Hearst, a nemesis of Theodore Roosevelt and a one-time presidential candidate himself in 1904, paid for a nationwide radio address in early 1932 to blast the disciples of Woodrow Wilson, fatuously following his visionary policies of intermeddling in European politics. Hearst declared, "We should see to it that a man is elected to the presidency whose guiding principle is America first." Unwilling to challenge Hearst, Roosevelt publicly opposed American membership in the League of Nations and vowed that if he were elected president, debtor nations would pay the bills they owed to the United States. In a speech before the New York State Grange on February 2, 1932, he declared, "The League of Nations today is not the league conceived by Woodrow Wilson." Roosevelt claimed that the nations of Europe had not demonstrated a disposition to divert the huge sums spent on armament into the channels of legitimate trade, balanced budgets, and payment of obligations, and concluded the organization no longer served the highest purpose of the prevention of war and a settlement of international difficulties in accordance with fundamental American ideals. Notwithstanding his campaign rhetoric, Roosevelt was, at heart, an internationalist. He had traveled widely, understood the value of international trade, and perhaps most importantly, abhorred war as a waste of human life and resources. Privately, Roosevelt continued to embrace the Wilsonian view that global diplomacy could bring about a more peaceful world. The 1932 Democratic Convention was held in Chicago at the end of June. Roosevelt campaigned throughout the country and won a majority of the 17 state primaries, and arrived in Chicago with the firm commitment of 600 delegates. However, he needed 770 votes to secure the two-thirds majority required by party rules at the time, and there were a number of potential aspirants to the White House, including John Nance Garner, the Speaker of the House, as well as his one-time mentor, former Governor Al Smith of New York. Garner had won the important primaries of his home state of Texas and, with the support of William Randolph Hearst, had trounced Roosevelt in California. Smith, an undeclared candidate, posed perhaps the biggest threat to Roosevelt's nomination. He and Roosevelt had once been close friends, but now were bitter rivals. For 2 days before the balloting began, delegates haggled and horse-traded over chairmanship of the party, convention rules, and the party platform in efforts to gain an advantage for their preferred candidates. The balloting process finally began on July 1st, but the convention soon deadlocked. After the third ballot, the delegates adjourned, promising to reconvene in the evening for the fourth ballot. Back in his hotel room, Roosevelt's campaign manager, Louis Howe, assessed the situation and decided that there was no way to persuade Al Smith's delegates to support Roosevelt. The Ohio and Illinois blocs pledged their respective favorite sons would hang on grimly in hopes of a dark horse nomination. That left the California and Texas delegations, at the time, pledged to Speaker Garner. Approaching Garner through 2 separate Texas allies, the Roosevelt camp offered the Speaker the vice presidential nomination if he would withdraw. Garner wanted to think it over. While Garner equivocated, Hearst, monitoring the proceedings from the comfort of his California estate at San Simeon, began to question whether or not the Speaker could win the nomination. Roosevelt's operatives tried to reach Hearst by telephone but were unsuccessful. However, early in the morning on July 2nd, Hearst accepted a call from Joseph P. Kennedy, an early Roosevelt supporter whom Hearst had gotten to know during the late 1920s when Kennedy lived in Los Angeles and was making millions in the movie industry. Kennedy persuaded Hearst that Garner could not win, and that if the convention remained deadlocked, then a potential dark horse, perhaps an internationalist, might carry the day. For Hearst, internationalism was an anathema and disqualified any candidate who embraced it. Because Roosevelt had walked back his Wilson-era belief in the League of Nations, Hearst favored him over other remaining prospects, like Wilson's former Secretary of War Newton Baker, another undeclared candidate waiting in the wings. Hearst telephoned Garner and advised him to fall in behind Roosevelt and release his delegates. Other political bosses put pressure on Garner as well. The Speaker acquiesced, and after some internal debate within the delegations, both California and Texas lined up behind Roosevelt. The next day, Franklin Roosevelt was officially nominated as the 1932 Democratic candidate for president. At the time, few people understood that Roosevelt's statements on America's role in the world, carefully crafted to satisfy William Randolph Hearst, helped him secure his party's nomination. Following the convention, Roosevelt's sons Franklin Jr., James, and John joined him for a 2-week vacation aboard a 40-foot yawl that set sail from Long Island up the Atlantic coast to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Afterward, during the remaining weeks of the summer and into the fall, Roosevelt crisscrossed the country by train. In September, he traveled to Los Angeles, which had hosted the Summer Olympics the previous month. The Boston Globe reported that Joe Kennedy joined the trip as a member of the candidate's inner circle, and that Kennedy was consulting on policy as well as discussing political tactics and business matters with Roosevelt. Kennedy also contributed $10,000 directly to the campaign and lent it another $50,000. Roosevelt and Kennedy had known each other for a number of years, beginning when Roosevelt served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the Wilson administration, and Kennedy, 6 years his junior, was the assistant manager of the Fore River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts. As Kennedy remembered years later, "We never got along then." Their first encounter was not an auspicious beginning. In early 1917, Roosevelt summoned Kennedy to the Navy Department. The Assistant Secretary appealed to the shipyard manager to release 2 Argentinian-built battleships that were docked at Quincy and badly needed for service in the Atlantic. The only problem was that the government needed the ships delivered immediately and wanted them on credit. "Don't worry," Roosevelt assured Kennedy. "The State Department will collect the money for you." However, Kennedy refused the Assistant Secretary's request and argued that the ships could only be delivered after they were fully paid for. Roosevelt rose from his desk, smiled, and put his arm around Kennedy, and then quietly informed him that if the ships were not delivered immediately, he would use the power of the government to expropriate them. An indignant Kennedy returned to Boston and ignored Roosevelt. A week later, 4 tugboats carrying armed soldiers arrived at the shipyard and seized the battleships. Kennedy would later remember Roosevelt as the toughest traitor I'd ever run up against. In October, Roosevelt set off on a second whistle-stop tour through the Midwest, South, and Mid-Atlantic. Kennedy was not invited on this trip, likely because Louis Howe, the campaign manager, neither liked nor trusted him. Howe thought Kennedy too close to Wall Street and likely heard the rumors that Kennedy had voted for Herbert Hoover in 1928. But other financial backers were along for the ride. Breckinridge Long, a friend from their days serving in the Wilson administration, was on board and occasionally introduced the candidate at events. Long had supported Roosevelt from the beginning of the campaign and was a member of a small group of political supporters who referred to themselves as WRBC, with Roosevelt before Chicago. Some of President Hoover's advisers had been eager to confront Roosevelt in the election of 1932, believing that the New York governor's paralysis would make it impossible for him to wage an effective campaign, much less fulfill the duties of the presidency. What is he himself thinking about when he allows himself to aspire to that office? Hoover's congressional liaison, James McLafferty, sneered. During the fall campaign, President Hoover never talked about Roosevelt's disability, instead attacking his social philosophy, which he called very different from the traditional philosophies of the American people. Hoover warned that these so-called New Deals would destroy the very foundations of American society. Louis Howe concluded that, because President Hoover was so unpopular, Roosevelt's main strategy should be not to commit any gaffes that might divert the public's attention. Foreign policy was barely mentioned. While Roosevelt didn't offer specific programs or policies to address the economic crisis at home, in a famous speech to the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco on September 23rd, he talked about the need to redress the balance between corporate and individual economic rights. The capitalist marketplace had failed, and, in his view, only the federal government could resuscitate the economy and put people back to work. As he put it, "Every man has a right to life, and this means that he also has a right to make a comfortable living." While many Americans came to know Roosevelt via newsreels and the radio, he was never filmed in his wheelchair, and the vast majority of Americans were unaware of his physical disability. During the fall of 1932, he waged an energetic campaign, traveling around the country, attacking Hoover and promising better days ahead. Whenever Roosevelt spoke before a crowd, he pulled himself to an upright position, standing at a podium or at the rear of a train, as a band or orchestra played "Happy Days Are Here Again." His campaign song and ever-present smile lent an air of optimism and hope to every campaign appearance. The outcome of the election was never really in doubt. The American people wanted change. On November 8th, Franklin Roosevelt won 42 states and nearly 23 million votes, crushing the incumbent president who managed to win only 6 states and fewer than 16 million votes. Roosevelt was elected President of the United States with a lopsided electoral vote victory of 472 to 59. Soon after his election, Roosevelt asked a wealthy former diplomat named William Bullitt if he would travel to Europe to investigate the issue of World War I debts owed by Germany to the United States under the Treaty of Versailles. Roosevelt was concerned that Germany was not adhering to the treaty. He also recognized that Europe had its own economic crisis and wanted a report on the general state of European affairs. Bullitt had been working on the campaign at the headquarters in Albany through the fall, editing speeches and preparing a daily digest of the news. Roosevelt first met Bullitt in early October, but undoubtedly already knew him by reputation. Though only 41 years old, Bullitt had been something of a controversial figure in Democratic Party circles for many years. As a young man, during World War I, Bullitt had been a diplomatic prodigy, sent to Moscow to negotiate in 1917 with Lenin on behalf of President Wilson. Bullitt later became disillusioned with President Wilson for his failure to stand by the 14 points laid out in a speech before Congress in January 1918 as the foundation for a lasting peace. Bullitt testified before Congress that Wilson had betrayed the Allies in the Treaty of Versailles, and his widely reported testimony was a contributing factor to the congressional defeat of American participation in the League of Nations in 1919. Many Democrats in Congress at the time were angered by what they viewed as Bullitt's disloyalty to the president. Bullitt was handsome, quick-witted, and extremely knowledgeable. Educated at Yale and Harvard Law School, he hailed from Philadelphia and was a descendant of the founding father Patrick Henry. He had been married and divorced twice, first to socialite Amy Ernesta Drinker and then to Louise Bryant, a free-spirited feminist and writer whom he had asked on a date after reading her exclusive interview with Prime Minister Benito Mussolini of Italy. Bryant had previously been married to John Reed, a Harvard-educated American journalist turned Russian revolutionary who was buried in the Kremlin. Bullitt also had something of a reputation as novelist. He published a novel in 1926 entitled It's Not Done, which sold over 150,000 copies. By contrast, F. Scott Fitzgerald published The Great Gatsby the same year but sold only 20,000 copies. Bullitt and the president-elect were immediately drawn to one another. Roosevelt, who had an eye for talent, wanted the former diplomat on his team. Bullitt was intrigued with the idea of undertaking a secret mission for the next president of the United States.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?